The Nintendo Switch is a pretty new console, relatively speaking, and throughout its short life it's been very successful both commercially and in terms of fan reception. It would seem that the Switch is going to go down as one of the best systems Nintendo has ever made. But will it? Sheesh, someone's running out of ideas. Brian, you don't need to say things people are already going to comment. And for the record, I have plenty of ideas. Shut up. Honestly, I think this is a little interesting to think about though. Obviously, with the Switch still having several years left in its lifetime, now isn't the best time to be talking about how it's going to be remembered. But I think right now it's viewed incredibly positively by most Switch owners, and I really don't know if it's going to be remembered quite so fondly. Well, even though nobody, including myself, cares, let's get things started. Hello all 1,816 of you, I'm Redkwan, and how will the Nintendo Switch be remembered? Now, as a little bit of a disclaimer, this video will sound a little bit negative about the Switch. I don't mean it to sound that way, but that's really the only way I could phrase it. So, if you don't want to hear stuff that sounds negative about the Switch, even though it's really not as negative as it sounds, then I guess you don't have to watch the video. But if you do for some reason want to hear stuff that sounds negative about the Switch that isn't really as negative as it sounds, then you can watch if you want. I don't know why you'd want to. So first, let's start with how people see it now. Like I said earlier, right now the Switch is seen as a fantastic console by the average Nintendo fan. It seems like most people view the Switch as the dawn of a new Nintendo, who listens to their fans, who makes the games people want at a higher quality and faster rate than ever before, and who knows how to make hardware that has the features people want without adding gimmicks that people don't care about. And while a lot of that is pretty accurate, I like to be pessimistic and disagreeable about things for the sake of having a unique viewpoint. So I don't think the Switch is quite as great as it's cracked up to be. The Switch has a lot of problems that people seem to disregard, and I think that in a lot of ways it does some things worse than past Nintendo systems. It's very popular right now, and it has a lot of excitement around it, but I have my doubts that people will see it so positively when they look back on it. So, what are these things that the Switch is lacking? Well, I think a lot of it starts with the online ecosystem. Obviously, there have been problems with Switch Online, so that's part of it, but that actually seems to be one thing that people constantly are criticizing the Switch over. The fact that the online service costs money and that it still has issues with functionality could be something people look back on poorly, but I honestly don't think that's the main thing. When I look at the Switch's online options, the thing I find most disappointing is the lack of a virtual console. I know a lot of people don't really think this is very important, but the virtual console gives you access to most of the best games from Nintendo's past. If you can get past the graphics, you have the option of playing pretty much every great Nintendo game, and for almost nothing. I've also heard people say that the Switch has NES games you could play through the online service, which is a virtual console, but excuse? I'm sorry, but this dumpy selection of NES games isn't the virtual console. Don't even joke! Just for reference, on the Switch you have access to the NES Marios, Odyssey, New Super Mario Bros. U, and Mario Maker 2 for Mario platformers. While the Wii U had the NES Marios, Mario 3D World, New Super Mario Bros. U, Mario Maker, New Super Mario Bros. Wii, Mario Galaxy 2, Mario 64, and Super Mario World. That's an insane amount. For Zelda, it's probably even crazier. The Switch has Breath of the Wild and the NES games, and we know it's getting a Breath of the Wild sequel and remastering of Link's Awakening, but the Wii U had Breath of the Wild, the NES games, A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword. That's the impact of the Virtual Console. I understand why Nintendo is not doing the Virtual Console, and it makes sense, but I do think this may be something that's seen as a bit of a knock against the Switch in the future. Honestly, this probably won't be the biggest thing, especially since nobody else seems to think it's nearly as amazing as I do. I can't lie, it's a little weird. But I do think the Virtual Console was a great thing to have on the Wii and Wii U, and when we look back at it and the rest of the Switch's online offerings, that may be something that doesn't sit as well. And I know this isn't saying much, but my next point might be even better. Let's hope. So let's talk about Switch games. People love Switch games. It probably seems a little weird to even bring this up, but if people love them now, that means they have more room to fall in the future. Man, I'm a downer. Oh my gosh. Who says stuff like that? Anyways, people love Switch games, and I'm not here to tell you that Switch games are bad, but I think the general perception of the games on the Switch probably doesn't quite correlate to how good these games actually are. Why? Because the Switch is exciting. The Switch seems to still be a very exciting piece of hardware, and I think there's this general feeling that the Switch is a cool and new system that represents something new for Nintendo. And I think that contributes to the games on the Switch being more exciting and being received better because of that. This doesn't apply to every game, and I'm not saying these games aren't still good, but I think to some extent we're getting the effect of people enjoying games more because they want to like them. Redkwan, have you ever thought maybe you don't like the games because you want to not like them? or because you're a jerk, Brian, I do not need this right now. Let's look at the biggest games to have hit the Switch so far, and see if they deserve all the praise they've gotten, and how people are going to see these things in the future. Let's start with Zelda Breath of the Wild. This one probably is going to be remembered very well. It's a very impressive game in terms of scope, and people really enjoyed playing it. I think this one might not be remembered quite as well as people think of it now, just because right now people see it as one of the best games ever made, but I think it'll still retain a lot of that. The only thing that makes me think it has a chance of being remembered a little less positively is that it did still have a lot of problems that made the game less fun. The Divine Beasts weren't that great on the whole, and shrines seem to be pretty divisive for people. I still think people will love this game in the future, but it might drop off a little bit if people look back on it as something that's more impressive than it was enjoyable. But while I think Breath of the Wild will largely hold up, the rest of the Switch's games might not be so lucky. Mario Odyssey was incredibly popular when it came out, and while most people still like it, I do think you can already see people starting to turn away from it a little bit. People seem a lot less enthusiastic about Mario Odyssey than they used to. You still hear a lot of people talking about Breath of the Wild all the time, but Mario Odyssey, even though it sold more copies and came out more recently, already sort of feels forgotten. I'm not sure if people didn't think the gameplay was as rewarding, with moons scattered around everywhere, or if there weren't enough platforming areas or memorable enough moments, but for whatever reason, people don't seem to think Mario Odyssey is anything special anymore. I still think people will like it, but it might not go down as something like Super Mario 64, like it kind of looked like it would for a while. And honestly, there aren't really that many other big awesome games on the Switch. We have Super Smash Bros. Obviously, and it was a fun game, but to me at least, I don't think it's a huge improvement over the other Smash games. Yes, it has more characters, which is nice, but for most people, it's still basically the same experience. Mario Maker and Splatoon are in sort of the same boats. I know they each added a lot of new stuff, but I'm not really sure they were game-changing. They're good sequels, but I don't think they're anything people will be looking back on all that memorably in 10 years, especially since they're online-focused games, which tend to fade a little more. And besides the games I just listed, the games on the Switch have either been pretty good but nothing special, ports, or small third-party stuff. And I don't think any of those groups is really going to be all that memorable down the line. I know there are some exceptions with games that have smaller but more dedicated followings like Xenoblade and maybe Fire Emblem. I don't know, I haven't seen the reviews yet. But overall, there really aren't many big ones. I don't think the Wii U ports are going to be remembered very much, but I could be wrong about that since nobody had a Wii U. But it feels like ports usually aren't remembered as a big part of a system's game library, even if they were. As for third-party stuff, pretty much everything we've gotten has either been at least a few years old, and sometimes a lot older than that, or it's been indie stuff. I'm not knocking either of those groups because there are some great older games like Okami, Skyrim, and I don't really want to say it because people will beat me up over it, but Undertale? Who am I kidding? People are going to beat me up over this whole video. There's some great indie games too, like I know a lot of people really liked Celeste. But all in all, I really don't think there are many games on the Switch that people will love in the future. Maybe your pal Redkwan is wrong, and it's not exactly much of a stretch to think that, but I really have doubts that many of these games on the Switch are going to go down as great. And finally, let's talk about the system itself. The Switch is a very cool concept, and if there's one thing I think could single-handedly make the Switch remembered fondly, it's the concept of the thing. But again, I'm not so sure here either. There are some hardware issues like Joy-Cons drifting and disconnecting, kickstands being stupid, and there not being a car stick for my Mario Kart needs. And while the Switch is great in concept, it seems like a lot of people just use it as a handheld, which makes the ability to switch pretty useless for a lot of Switch owners. Not that it's not nice to have, but I think a lot of people don't really use the Switch how it's built to be used. So maybe the switching concept won't actually be remembered as being all that cool or useful as we see it now. Also, I'm not sure if, when we look back at the system, people are going to think Joy-Cons were a bad idea. I know that sounds stupid, but I've thought about it a little bit, and what's really the point? I guess it's nice to be able to take the Joy-Cons off and be able to use them as controllers when you're playing on the TV, but most people seem to have a Pro Controller for that kind of thing anyway, and in most other ways, the Joy-Cons just make things worse. To work on the Switch, in the grip, and as individual controllers, they need to be a little weird and awkward in all three areas. The only things that I've seen at least, where Joy-Cons are needed are sharing the Joy and 1-2 switch. I don't think I have to say anything about 1-2 switch, but also, do people actually share the Joy? It's super uncomfortable and difficult to play with Joy-Cons sideways, and I don't think many people actually use this feature. So does the Switch have uncomfortable base controllers that aren't very strong or reliable for no reason? Maybe. I'm not saying they're completely useless, but I wouldn't be surprised if we look back on Joy-Cons as being a little bit of a pain. So how will the Switch be remembered? Well, as you can probably tell from this video, I don't think it'll be remembered nearly as well as it's being received right now. I know it might have seemed like I really hate the Switch, but I don't think it's a bad system by any means. I sounded very harsh for no reason. But I think this generation is very high in excitement, and people are treating the Switch like the greatest system Nintendo's ever made. And I really don't think that quite equates to what we've gotten. Systems that are very successful and exciting have tended to lose favor down the line, and systems that flop tend to be seen in a much better light. For example, the GameCube didn't do very well at the time, but its games are seen as classics now, and the GameCube is one of the most loved consoles Nintendo's ever made. The Wii, on the other hand, was incredibly successful, and you could say it wasn't the video game crowd who was excited, but it was still a huge deal that people were crazy about, and now people look down on it. And I think a lot of that comes down to the excitement the systems each had at the time. Will people remember liking the Switch? I'm sure they will. But I do think a lot of the problems with the games, the functions, and the system itself are being glossed over because of the Switch's success, and I don't think people will see the Switch as being as great as we see it now in the future. I'm sure people will really hate this video, and I don't blame them. It's a little rude. But I don't hate the Switch, and if people are enjoying it now, it's great that they can do that. Nobody cares about this question anyway, so please don't unsubscribe. Well, I'm Redkwan. I have some trash opinions on some trash topics. How do you think the Switch will be remembered? How little do you care? How much do you hate my guts? Probably a lot. Come back next week for Does the Switch Have Too Matte of a Finish? Yeah, real funny, Brian. Can I use that? Anyways, I'm Redkwan. Thank you all for watching, and I'll hopefully see you all later. Goodbye.